Take charge. Call to order the meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission for the Tuesday, July the 9th. Item 2, public comment. Citizens who desire to address.
Move the microphone.
Well, hell, I turned it on. That's a start. Huh? Where we at? Who desire to address planning with regard to matters. We can dispense with that. I don't see anybody in the audience that's a public anyhow, except for staff. I don't think they're going to.
If you wouldn't mind going ahead, just for
Regard to matters on the agenda we received at this time. The number of speakers will be limited to the first 10 speakers, and each speaker is limited to 3 minutes. Seeing no one come forth, item 3, the minutes. Consideration and action on the minutes of June the 27th, 2019 meeting.
Motion to approve.
A motion by Landine. Who was the second? Okay. A motion and second. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll vote at this time or catch up here. I'll try to vote at this time. Why can't I get this thing down there? Yep, here it is. Yeah.
One more.
Well, I did it. It just didn't take. Motion passes unanimously to those in attendance. Item 4, fact-finding and recommendation. Consideration of and action on a recommendation for the proposed rezoning of 5.8 acres from standard single-family residential R1 to planned development PD district final development plan. Grants Lake, Tempo Section 1, townhome community, to the mayor and members of city council. Doug?
Thank you, sir. Members of the commission, this evening we are essentially having part 2 of the case that we talked about first on June 27th with the public hearing for the Grants Lake townhome community known as Tempo Section 1. And so I'm going to go over a number of things just for the record so that we're covering that. A lot of this is information that you have heard before, and also recap a little bit of our hearing and then subsequent work since that time. Grants Lake Tempo Section 1, just looking at the vicinity map. This is State Highway 6. This is Grants Lake. This is the townhome complex here. This was platted and developed back in 1982, 5.8 acres, 80 residential townhome lots that are in 13 buildings total. So these are multiple lots that are consolidated into overall buildings. Property was brought into the city back at the end of 1991 as one of the municipal utility annexations in First Colony, fully developed at that time, and zoning was subsequently applied. A fire did occur late 2018. It was actually in November of last year, related to one building, number 24. The building has 8 townhome lots with it. This brought attention to what type of codes were needed for rebuilding, as well as the zoning, the platting, all of those types of things. And as part of that investigation, the city became aware that rezoning was needed for that reconstruction. The all-new construction separately is required to meet current fire and building safety codes. But again, we looked at the zoning and realized that for whatever reason, following annexation, this had been brought in as R1 as part of a larger area and did not have the necessary zoning to be in conformity. So we looked a little bit at aerial last time, and again, we're just going to recap. This is essentially the boundary of the property, the 5.8 acres. This area is the Building 24 area, again, with 8 lots. This complex is very similar to Grants Lake Tempo Section 2, which is actually up in this location by Highway 6. And as we mentioned on the 27th, this is going to be the subject of a future corrective city-initiated zoning, very similar to this PD, but that's going to be at a future time. Going over the public hearing that you had at your last meeting, we had one speaker, property owner in Building 24, requested the rezoning process to move forward as quickly as possible, talked some about some of the hardships that they have been dealing with that, and of course, it's one of the reasons for this city-initiated corrective action. Staff talked about replacing what is there now in terms of the existing zoning with a planned development for the entire complex. This is not being done just for one building. This is being done comprehensively as an approach that doesn't alter the existing deed restrictions, the existing development, but does provide a path forward for repairs and reconstruction at the property throughout this 5.8 acres in the future. We also talked a little bit about our recommendations in the materials that y'all received, structured with the type of layout that you see typically in PDs with applicants. This was based on the recorded plat as essentially kind of quote-unquote the roadmap, based on field investigation at the site, multiple field visits, documenting actual layout, design, and development. And trying to match that category as closely as we can with essentially this custom zoning. The commission had a number of comments and feedback and questions. We did talk in detail about the PD process and the exhibits, fire safety codes, and the commission did request revisions to Exhibit B, D1, D2, and D3. Plat excerpt here, and we're going to just go over briefly. Again, this is the 1982 plat. We talked about the plat at the meeting, talked about how this had been set up at that time. One of the questions that came up was related to how the site is served by utilities, and we agreed to research that as well. The site is master metered at 2 locations at the right-of-way at Grant Lakes Boulevard. These do not have individual meters at each unit. They are set up closer to a condo or apartment layout than you would have now at a brand new platted site that started from vacant land. However, they're master metered. The utilities inside that are public relate to the specific easements on the plat that are related to fire suppression and fire hydrant. The rest of the utilities are private in there, and those are the responsibility of the HOA. So these are essentially the last 37 years of the development. So we have visited with Public Works, both Rob Valenzuela and Brian Butcher, in terms of the system. They've looked at everything closely, and again, while this PD process is not proposing to create easements or change meters, we wanted to better understand what was the layout at the property and make sure that we had examined that based on questions that were asked. So looking further in at, just again for the record and for anyone viewing online, these are site pictures that show various parts of the development, some of the pathways, the pedestrian areas, the existing covered parking. You can see examples of both siding and masonry on the buildings. Here we have some area near the Grants Lake, the water body itself, with some brick fencing, and then some perimeter fencing that's wood fencing along the southern property line. Finally, here are some pedestrian paths along both the amenity area where the pool area is on the eastern side of Grants Lake Boulevard, and then along the actual lake shore itself with some units in that location. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where we are since then, and I wanted to go ahead and acknowledge Commissioner Stevens did reach out to staff as we were working through a number of revisions, and we did sit down and discuss further some information that was based on the packet that we sent y'all. That resulted in some additional clarification that we added, and that is why you have the red line at your position this evening. A lot of this was related to essentially further clarifying so there would not be questions on setbacks with parking and landscaping, not only for the outer perimeter, which is the plat boundary, and we use some further defining terms such as the 600 and 80-something boundary along the bottom. But also, how did any of these parking or landscape setbacks work with the actual townhome unit lots? We had referred more generally to property lines, but that was one area that needed to be further defined. And again, we looked at the plat, both with any kind of dimensioning as well as scaling, so that we're trying to be as essentially belt and suspenders as possible on the call-outs for those, for reconstruction, repair in the future. Some additional information that we, after further discussion, talked about was creating a basic type of chart that took the elevations, which, as we talked about at the last meeting, are based primarily on Building 24, north, south, east, and west elevations, but are also going to be used as a general guide to the other buildings, which have a lot of commonality. And so, since directions will be different depending on which buildings there are, we took and went ahead and created that chart type way as, I'm going to call it almost like a key map or a key to further decipher those elevations. Because in some cases, what's shown on Building 24 as a north and a south may be the east and west of the other ones. So we thought that approach, after some additional discussion, we thought that approach would be reasonable. Somebody looking at this 5 years from now or more, there's not a question as to any type of location with that. We have added language, and I'm going to go ahead and show you on some actual documents here. We went ahead and added this bigger directional. These plans were based on the architect's overall base map, but it had a very small north arrow here. So again, this is the directional arrow, and also will be used as what is east, west, north, south for Exhibit D2 and D3. Those are those exterior elevations. And so that this is more centered. Other than that, this is essentially the same material that you looked at last time. Looking at the elevations, what we've added at the top was some language about how these elevations are related not only to Building 24, but also they're providing a general guide for any repair and reconstruction of those other buildings. So this additional text is going to work hand in hand with that references in Exhibit B, the chart, as well as the other language. And as the Commission pointed out last time, we had some specific call-outs that had been done by the architect originally about using hardy plank siding was one of them, and some, it didn't further define on the shingles, although there's a recorded restriction against wood shingles. So we've been able to go in and make sure that we didn't have any brand-specific things, because although we hadn't put that together originally, that wasn't going to be hard to go ahead and be more general. So we feel like that's enhanced the elevations. I also went ahead and included a call out for glass and use the word typical. That's not uncommon. But since we are mentioning glass, let's go ahead and at least call out the type of material there, so that there's no question as to what you're looking at on the future ones. And this is those side views, the north and south elevation of that Building 24, we've got the same type of language, and we've also locked in that more general language for the use for other buildings, tied into the chart that we now have in the red lines to kind of complete that. And again, we did the same thing with simplifying some of the call-outs on the roofing and what was originally labeled hardy plank. No changes to the landscaping layout. However, based on some of that further conferring, we went ahead and added a little more description in Exhibit B, trying to more closely tie into what were we really trying to do. This drawing here is really more of a tree survey. What did I see when I went out on the property? What did I measure? Both with the trees that qualify as protected trees, which are a tree that's at least 8-inch caliper and that's a hardwood. However, truthfully, out there, all of these trees were not only hardwood, but very specific live oaks. So trees that were that big in caliper were all live oaks. But we have provided the opportunity for, if they need to replace in the future, to be able to use numerous other hardwood trees. So we didn't want there to be any question on there that about what we were trying to propose. That's pretty typical. We just don't tend to have a PD that's dealing with a built environment that has all these existing features. So again, we're trying to make it as clear as possible what we're documenting, but also what they can replace things with. And these are all things we believe are important. They help make the site what it is. And so if there are changes in the future to those trees, we want to make sure the path is as clearly defined as possible. As the Commission probably remembers, we were also documenting some of that brick fencing in multiple places, as well as that perimeter fence. Now, this, again, is not something where we have single family next to a townhome. In fact, the property to the south is condominiums, the Grants Lake condominium development. But again, should that fencing be replaced, we want it to be replaced with something at least as good as what's there. And we also had the opportunity in the language that could be replaced with masonry. But we did call out that specifically. We really haven't had any changes to the pedestrian layout, but again, just for the record, this is laying out the specific pedestrian paths that are internal. We have the public sidewalk, which if there is an issue in the future, it's part of the city responsibilities there. But should any of this be removed in the future, it's going to need to be reconstructed at least to these minimum locations. I did want to make sure that we had gone ahead and covered all the exhibits, and so again, I also included things like the plant list as well here in my presentation. No changes to it, but we've tied this in Exhibit B as to you have these various options for replanting, the shade trees, some additional smaller tree options such as the crepe myrtle and those type of plants, and then some basic shrubs. We also have the standard language that Director of Planning has the ability to approve alternate landscaping. Our code has language as well, so that we have that if somebody wants to look at something different. But this is the guide, this is the roadmap for that. As we mentioned last time, the future land use map, 2018 adopted as part of the overall Chapter 6 future land use plan. It does show this area. There's a variety of in the Grants Lake area for higher density, in that medium density category. It's not out of alignment with any of that work, and we believe we've tried to address everything that we've heard up to this point. We hope that we have put together something that is as comprehensive as possible. We know in talking with, again, the contractor, and we had some correspondence who was not able to be here tonight, but we've said we've tried to address everything we believe we can. We know the plat is essentially the roadmap of this development, but this does allow reconstruction, repair at this site in a comprehensive way. If somebody comes in the future someday and wants to totally redo the entire layout, different lots, all of that, then we're going to have to look at a PD amendment to essentially redo. We'd have to look at some replatting. But as we stand here, we believe this is a good comprehensive approach. So we do request a recommendation from the commission to the mayor and council for approval of the PD, and essentially we suggest with the red line updates that we've provided to the commission to Exhibit B, further clarifying the parking, landscape, and those elevations. And again, we wanted to provide that so that we were not just discussing this verbally, that we had some prior conversations. We were able to integrate that in and wanted to have that tonight. And again, as much time as needed to look over it, but we do believe that does strengthen this and gets us a lot further to where we need to be. That's all we have. Be happy to take any questions or comments.
Anybody have any questions down here?
I had two hopefully quick questions, Doug. Okay, I'm looking at the red lines. I guess these are to Exhibit, you said B.
Okay. Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Under item 4, drive aisles and parking areas. You with me?
Yes, sir.
A says, as I'm reading the red line, drive aisles must maintain a 28-foot wide private drive aisle as illustrated on Exhibit C. Is that what that's supposed to say?
Right, the recorded plat.
Right, but a drive aisle must maintain a 28-foot wide private drive aisle? Okay, I'm just checking.
Right. Right, we're essentially saying this is how they are, and anything in the future, we don't want that narrowed down. If there was any reconstruction, that needs to essentially be rebuilt with that minimum width.
All right, I'm just checking to see if that's how you really
Sure.
wanted to word it. And then item C says that a 5-foot minimum parking setback is required along the entire 682-foot southern plat boundary perimeter. And then item E, 1B, says that a 5-foot minimum landscape buffer is required along the entire 682-foot southern plat boundary perimeter also. Are those
Right, right.
Are those in addition to each other?
Those are essentially kind of working together, but they're called out that no matter what, it's got to be, you don't just have the setback from parking, but it's got to be landscaped essentially, yes.
Okay, so not a total of 10 feet.
I want to make sure that I don't have a typo in that. I'm following you. Shown on Exhibit B. I know that on the, and I'm going to toggle back to, go to 11 here. So on the southern property line, we essentially have not less than 5 feet is scaled. Then there is this little corner area here where we believe there is a smaller area of about 4 feet. Then we've covered areas that are some of the covered parking spots. So I just want to make sure that the area with the 10 feet that was for any accessory structures up there, so I'm trying to make sure we don't have a discrepancy.
Well, I think, Doug, on the 682, what you got is a 10-foot water line easement on it. But I think that the setback on the parking is only 5.
Only 5, right.
And I didn't understand or realize that what you're saying, Matt, is that we've added a 5-foot landscape reserve. I don't remember us talking about that. So is that what you've done, Doug, is tried to add a 5-foot landscape reserve on top of that 5-foot setback for the parking? Is that one?
Right, to make sure that
So
it couldn't just be concreted over or something, even if it's not parking, that essentially that's going to need to be landscaped either way. And then I know when we moved over into this area along the side. We had a little part that, again, based on the limited materials we have, including the plat, where it narrows down slightly smaller than 5, so we've talked about a 4
Well,
on that.
what I requested and came over and visited with Doug was to see, because the copy we have in our deal is so small that I couldn't tell what the label, whether it was 2 feet or 5 feet. But then you look at the plat itself, and it looks like one's wider than the other. So we came over and got out his big copy, and there was some of that discrepancy. So somewhere in here, he wrote it so that it could be no less than, I forget, 2 feet and 5 feet, depending on, what it was based on what it is on the ground. In other words, I don't know I forget how you worded it, Doug, but somewhere here we clarified that.
Yeah, I understand.
Part of that had, including, part of what Commissioner Stevens is also talking about is you've got a small setback along this covered parking in here, at some point scaled a little bit bigger than 2 feet, but it was always labeled as 2 feet on the actual plat call-out. So we also added a not less than, but not more than, to try to fit that. And again, it's part of this whole retrofitting thing has been a little bit different hat that we've put on for that. But if we'll double check this language before we put the ordinance for council, just make sure there's no duplication in that's not needed.
Okay, thank you.
Another way of saying that, Matt, is, and Doug, that 1982 plat probably would not have got approved by this commission.
That's one way to put it. That's exactly right. Or recommended by the staff. Again, it's probably we'd start with the fact that the even on the main plat, it's so small. Even at that case, the actual layout is it's difficult to see. So unless you really blow that up electronically.
So, Dan?
I really just have a comment. I mean, in scanning this, tracked changes and so forth that we have at our desk here, looks like you've really thoroughly addressed everything that was brought up last time and added a lot of clarity without, getting into the tall grass and taking time to review it. I'm going to trust that you got the job done. I mean, it is forensic in nature, and you guys have come this far, so I'm sure this is just putting the icing on the cake. So
Forensic, that's a good,
another good job.
Good word.
Is that all you, Dan? AP? Taylor? Jay? Good, thank you. Obviously, I covered mine with Doug in a couple of other sessions, so I think he's done a good job of getting it as close as we can get it to make sense going forward. Don't guarantee that we caught everything, but, what is it?
I feel we've got a good handle on as good as we're going to be able to essentially get at this point. And I feel like it reads pretty clear again for not only those of us who've been talking a lot about it and have been there familiar, but again, somebody for the future when they crack this thing open and we need to see what's there. So,
All right,
I'd like to make a motion.
go
Make a
ahead.
motion to approve and suggest to Mayor, City Council to approve for the rezoning of the 5.8 acres to the PD Final Development Plan for Grants Lake, Tempo, Section 1. Council community.
Second.
We got a motion by Jay and a second by Andy.
I would add that we include the.
Yes, as revised,
By
as suggested, and the revisions provided.
The updated red lines as presented to, or however you want
Exactly.
to, right. Correct. So you include that in your motion?
Yes, sir.
And you
So seconded.
Okay. All right. Is there any discussion? If not, we'll vote at this time. it looks like it passes unanimously with those, with those, no, wait a minute, we got one. Yeah, you're having the same problem I had earlier. Okay.
So Doug, when will it go to council?
August.
August? And then how soon after that can they get their building permit?
Could be by the end of that month.
Okay, good.
All right. Item 5, reports. Planning and Zoning Commission Liaison Report, City Council meeting July 2nd.
That's me. It was a pretty quick meeting on the 2nd where the council accepted donations from the Sugar Land Citizens Police Academy Alumni Association for some public safety, police, law enforcement equipment. Some really neat things were given to the police department as a part of that. ATVs, some breaching equipment, so it's really a neat thing that they did. Then they workshopped some public safety dispatch, and then closed out the meeting with the appointment of Councilmember McCutcheon as Mayor Pro Tem. And they adjourned.
All right. City staff report?
We'll make it very brief. Your next meeting we'll have at the end of this month, the 25th, and right now we've put public hearing together we're going to go ahead and move forward with the Greatwood commercial areas from the interim commercial zoning that's been on there since the limited purpose annexation. These are for the areas you see along 59 and just in Greatwood Parkway there. So permanent commercial zoning for that. We're going to bring the public hearing and discussion. Won't have a vote that night on it, but we'll go ahead and move forward on finalizing these additional areas that we annex. So that's all we have.
Doug, just on that, talking about doing
Yes,
that
sir.
stuff and going forward, is any of this, and does the Bill 2439 stuff come into any of this? I mean, do we have to, going forward, do we have to consider, doing the rezoning?
No issues with the permanent zoning on anything.
Okay.
Should be in good
Okay.
shape. Yes.
That thing bothers me. Anyhow, all right. Well, I guess, entertain a motion to adjourn. Got a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.